long introduction for me, and so you would just say, who's or her? Yeah. He's the guy she met on the bridge.
We can start now. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you who are not from the Institute of Sociology. This seminar is organized by our Gender and Sociology department. And I'm grateful so many people coming. We have two speakers today, and it's Professor C.Jurik and Professor Cavender from Arizona State University. They are from the School of Social Transformation from Arizona State University, and they are not new here. They had their lecture a couple of times in the last couple of years already. Last time they had a lecture in the autumn about basically their book they published last year. That's called Justice Provocateur, about women in policing, and especially the theory about the detective Tennyson, and it's a great sociological analysis. They came up with the new concept of progressive moral fiction. As you probably realize, they focus on the feminist aspects of law and of especially women in policing, media, and so on. So Professor C.Jurik focuses in her work as a sociologist on the labor market, entrepreneurship, and that's also an area where we cooperate, and women in justice and in criminal and in policing, in the profession of policing. And Professor Cavender is a sociologist also, but also a criminologist and scientist focusing on media and on how media depict crime. So I think I should stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to their performance, because that looks like will be very interesting. And thank you for coming here and giving us lecture.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and I always really enjoy my time here, and so thanks for letting us come visit you again. I was talking to somebody right before I left about coming here, and they said, well, you just go to Prague and have a vacation and see the sights. It's a pretty city. And I go, well, that all is true, but I really enjoy going because I think this is one of the neatest feminist think tanks and gender studies think tanks that I have the opportunity to interact with. And I always get to hear about your research, never enough, but I try to read what I can given the limitations of my Czech. I'm always excited by the work that's going on, and I've heard of some of the projects that you're planning for the future on the economic crisis and gender, and trying to come up with a sociological analysis of gender and the economic crisis. And I think these are just really exciting projects, and my one regret is that I don't even get to hear still more about them. But I will tell you a little bit about what we're doing. We have been asked to write a paper for a volume on why crime fiction is popular, the popularity of crime fiction and why it is so popular. So we started doing some research on this, turning to it this summer, and we began to realize that there were lots of experts saying why they thought crime fiction was popular. But very seldom was there any literature that actually went and asked real people, why do you like or dislike crime fiction? And so this is actually part of our effort to conduct some very informal focus groups to begin to ask real people, and we're beginning with scholars and students, to ask them, why do you like crime fiction or why don't you like it? And so that's what we're going to begin with. All right, we're going to begin by talking about some of the information that is evidence of the popularity of crime fiction, and we're going to show you a couple of film clips that will demonstrate, I think, the popularity of crime fiction in various ways, or some popular crime fiction. And I want to just call your attention to this. I thought that this looked like a good kind of film noir, kind of nice lighting and stuff, but this is actually the street behind the apartment where we were staying, Vlaška, and I don't remember what this street is, Sherry, but it's right up, the one that you go straight instead of veering left to Vlaška. So it's actually a really nice street, but I wanted it to look a little more scary. Okay, and we're going to talk broadly about crime fiction, so we're going to include film, television, as well as novels and short stories, and including in our films dramas, as well as some reference to satires about crime fiction. But the students we spoke to Micah Loha's class the other day, and they said, you have to think more about comedy and satire of this, and so we started to try to do that. A lot of people say that Edgar Allan Poe is the person who invented crime fiction, but there's evidence that it goes way back beyond him, and such that 1001 Arabian Nights had at least one, maybe two crime stories in it. And there were also ancient Chinese stories that were about magistrates dealing with a crime and punishment. Edgar Allan Poe, though, still has a sort of defining crime fiction formula where the protagonist uses rational deduction to think about and come up with solutions for crime. Of course, Sherlock Holmes is another one who's one of the most popular throughout history in crime fiction. Some people have criticized crime fiction and say that it's really lesser quality literary work. And some people really snub the reading of crime fiction because they think it's not up to literary standards. Other people argue that it's a very flexible literary genre and leaves room for a lot of creativity and even leaves room for dealing with important social issues while still using some of the same crime formula pieces of a protagonist looking for who did it. But it is very popular, and 20 to 25% of all novels worldwide are crime fiction novels, and that is from a blog, so it might not be exactly accurate, but we went and looked at the New York Times list of bestsellers, and we found that repeatedly about 4 out of 10 of the top-selling novels were crime novels. Over time, series like Law and Order, Crime Scene Investigation, and in the UK, The Bill, are really long-running series. Law and Order and The Bill are two of the longest-running. Crime fiction is popular all around the world. Countries like Italy, Spain, Sweden, Russia, Japan, China, Israel, and the Czech Republic all have their own crime fiction traditions that are indigenous to their countries. And it's so significant that in the past, some communist nations banned crime fiction. So did some fascist nations around the time of World War II banned crime fiction. They didn't want it out there. In the US, there were some crime fiction plots that were suspected during the McCarthy era in the 50s of being communist plots. And then at other times, crime fiction has been used as propaganda about why countries should go to war. And there was one called The Hangman, written by Bertolt Brecht, and a movie made by Fritz Lang, that a hangman must die, and that was set in the Czech Republic. There was also another film that was very classic, The Blue Dahlia, in the US, that was very popular, and it was a kind of pro-war, but showing also the pain experienced by people in war. The US and the UK have been places that have been considered to put out a lot of fiction that's sold around the world, but a lot of other countries have done so, and there's work coming out of China, the Czech Republic, and Italy that are really sweeping the world. Right now, there's a real rage of popularity about Scandinavian crime fiction, and so Gray will talk about that in a second. In the past, crime fiction has really been criticized as male-centered and male-dominated, both in terms of the authors who wrote it and the protagonists, and that the plots, especially in the film noir kind of things, or the hard-boiled fiction of the tough protagonist, often the woman was portrayed, if there at all, she was portrayed as sometimes the downfall or the threat to the male protagonist. And so there were exceptions, though, to this. And so, for example, Agatha Christie, with all of her various series, wrote 66 novels. And after the Bible and Shakespeare, more of her books have been published than any other writer in history. And she featured, not only she was a woman writing, but also she featured a woman protagonist, Miss Marple, who was a village woman who solved crimes based on her experience living in a village all her life. And she was always viewed to be kind of incompetent by the police until she solved the crime when they couldn't. And so you see a lot more fiction coming today, and there's some argument that in fact there are many more, and there are many more women authors, there are many more women characters in novels and TV and film that are strong women characters. And so some have argued that a feminist crime fiction has emerged. A feminist crime genre has emerged. This is a picture of our book. We have to have a little plug in here, but that we wrote about Jane Tennyson and Prime Suspect, a British series that was very popular in a lot of countries all over the world. And it's one episode in the 7-part series had 200 million viewers around the world. So it's very popular, and you've heard us talk about, some of you have heard of us talk about this, but it features a strong woman police officer trying to climb her way up the ranks of the London Metropolitan Police Force. And because it was broadcast for a couple decades, you got to see her even begin in and grow older in the series and actually move to retirement at the end.
As we were starting to work on this project that we're developing right now, the appeal of crime fiction, one of the things that struck us as very interesting, and again because we're from the US, and you hear so much also about the UK in crime fiction, was the popularity of crime fiction from Scandinavia in general. And I'm not going to say a lot about this other than to move into a particular point that we want to make. Scandinavian crime fiction has been very popular in the Scandinavian countries since the 1960s. There have been a lot of novels and a lot of television series that primarily featured police officers, typically male police officers. And that was the norm for a number of years. Recently, one of the changes that occurred is that these novels were finally translated into English. And they're very popular, they're very successful, and probably the epitome of the success is evidenced in the Stieg Larsson Millennium Trilogy. A girl with a dragon tattoo, a girl who played with fire, a girl who kicked up a hornet's nest. And you know a little about the story. Larsson was a newspaper person, had a magazine that was a very leftist magazine, was in hiding a lot because he was afraid the right wing would kill him, but apparently he was also writing novels that no one knew about. And he wrote these 3 novels. He couldn't get them published. He simply gave them to his agent, all completed. And finally they found a publisher. He died from a heart attack before he saw the success of these novels. And to date, his novels, posthumously, have sold 65 million copies. The 3 novels have been made into 3 Swedish films. The first film also has been made into a film in the United States. Now, the reason we mention that is not only to show the popularity of this kind of fiction, but also to comment on the fact that one of the things that Larsson did in these novels is to center a woman protagonist. And so he's beginning to shift the Scandinavian police procedural with a man to thriller novels with a protagonist as a woman. And I think I've got this in my notes. There are just now starting to be scholarly treatments of the Stieg Larsson Millennium Trilogy. And we saw one just the other day. I haven't ordered the book yet, but it's a book of readings entitled Men Who Hate Women and Women Who Kick Their Asses, the Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy from a feminist perspective. And so the books are, and the films are starting to get a lot of notoriety from academics, but because of their focus on women.
Have any of you seen any of these films? Some of you have.
The other series that we became interested in, we may try to show a clip. If it doesn't work, we can at least hand out the box, is a Danish police procedural, a TV series called The Killing. And the series was very popular in Denmark, where it was made. And what was surprising, though, is that even though it was subtitled, the series was extremely popular in the UK. It was a top-rated program in the UK. And the series, which initially was intended to be 1 year, has now completed its 3rd year. It was so successful. There was even a US version of The Killing that was made, set not in Copenhagen, but in Seattle. And I think they tried to have sort of the same dreary, bleak kind of look at the world. And the series is essentially about a woman police officer who tries to solve the murder of a young woman. And the entire first season deals with this young woman's murder. And each week's installment focuses on a different suspect. And only at the end do we find out who the actual killer was. As I say, the program was extremely popular in the UK, and so popular that the sweater...
We should show the clip first.
Oh, we're going to show the clip first.
If we can, I think. We hope. He showed me how to do it. I'm not sure this is going to have any subtitles, so it may all be in Danish, so some of you probably know it, and I don't, but this is mostly an action sequence. There it is. I apologize, this is also sort of scary and gory, so you may want to look away at some parts. I'll make it big. So I'm going to, oh, it's big over there.
Jeg troede, der var et eller andet, jeg havde glemt at pakke.
Jag förstår om du är orolig, men det här kommer bli jättebra. Jag ska göra allt jag kan för att det ska gå.
Det var overhovedet ikke det. Ja, vågen bare. Jeg glæder mig.
Till att bli svensk. Det är omöjligt.
Jeg glæder mig til at bo sammen med dig.
Det ska bli meget, meget dejligt. Jag är lite kaffe.
Ja, det gør.
Jeg vil bare huset. Jeg var hjemme, så fandt det 6 til bygningen ude på. Der får det væk andre med, og jeg er så kommet i gang med at afhøre i de opgange, der har lejlighed ud til gården.
Gamle pige.
Det er muligt at sige. Jeg tror, han har set noget lignende. Du kender den skulle have af.
Hvis du føler dig overbevist om, at letøl og surstrømme vil gøre dit liv sødere, så er du i din fulde ret til at prøve det.
Tak.
Sara, jeg er ikke i tvivl om, at Stockholmspolitiet vil få stor glæde af dig. Jeg vil gerne ønske dig held og lykke med dit nye liv hos arvefjenden, og når jeg siger, at du vil blive savnet, så er jeg sikker på, at jeg taler på vegne af hele afsnittet.
So the plot of this first season is that Sarah Lund is a very successful police detective for the Copenhagen police. She has a teenage son. She's met a man from Sweden with whom she's fallen in love, and she's leaving her job in Copenhagen and going to move to Sweden, where she's going to work with the Swedish police. But before that can happen, unbeknownst to her and the squad yet, a young woman has been murdered. Lund will be asked to stay for one day to see what sort of headway she can make in the case. And that one day turns into an entire season, and as she works in the case. She's just depicted as having very severe work-life balance problems. She's extremely focused. She's not a very good mom because she works so much on the job. The film the series is very political. There's a lot of politics involved in terms of Copenhagen city politics. Some of the suspects are police or politicians running for mayor in the city. But again, what was interesting about the program is it was so successful in the UK, even though it was shown in the original with English subtitles. The actress who played Sarah Lund became something of an international success. Her name is Sophie Grabel. The sweater that she wore, which the Brits call a jumper, became one of the most popular clothing items in England that year. They sold out. When Prince Charles and Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, went to Denmark, they met Sophie Grabel, and she gave them an actual jumper that she had worn in the series, and this was viewed as up there with the crown jewels, apparently, to have a series of this sort. As we were scrolling through some of the work, we saw that you can actually buy this sweater online for only £280, and they guarantee it will be available by Christmas. And they make dandy presents.
But you have to order it now.
Even at £280 a sweater. But the reason we wanted to talk about this is it shows in some ways a change that's going on in the Scandinavian procedural, and that the procedural is becoming more woman-oriented. And indeed, so much so that a term has grown up about this called femi-crimi. And so not only do you have Larsen and the man who wrote The Killing, you increasingly have productions, whether they're novels or other TV programs or films, that are written by women authors with women protagonists, many of which deal with feminist issues, ranging from domestic violence to being blocked in the workplace, and yet these women solve crimes. They're not all police. One of the more successful series of novels is a novel about a crime reporter who encounters sexism in the newspaper that she works for. I think this is a Swedish production. So the femi-crimi is beginning to take over in the Scandinavian countries. One of the things we were trying to do, in a sense, to localize our presentation today is look at various countries, including Czech Republic, and to see the history of the crime genre in Czech Republic. And our Google searches, in part enhanced by Alena, revealed a number of fairly famous Czech novelists, like Karel Čapek, who was a very successful novelist. But he also apparently was very influenced by Arthur Conan Doyle, really liked Sherlock Holmes, and back in the 1920s wrote some crime fiction. More recently, the novelist Josef Škvorecký, who fled Czech Republic in the 1960s because he was viewed as an enemy of the state. His legitimate novels were banned here. He fled to Canada, where he spent the remainder of his life. But he also wrote crime fiction, and his Lieutenant Borůvka series was a very popular series of novels. When he was no longer banned in Czech Republic, he had a TV program on based on the Father Knox series, which he did not originate, but he created this TV program that was apparently very innovative. And it was innovative in that you were not, as the audience, told who the guilty person was. Rather, you were supposed to figure it out yourself and call the television station and tell them who did it. And apparently it was a fairly popular TV series. Another colleague of Alena's told us about a TV program that was on a couple of years ago called Expozitura, which was a Czech TV series about a woman police officer who investigates corruption in the police department. And it's a series-long investigation, and it's exciting and dangerous because she can't count on her colleagues because they may be part of this organized crime group. Expozitura. Nancy and I have tried to watch it some. And it's based on a real case. In other words, a woman really did this. I think what Alena said is the difference is, in the real case, the woman had a son, so she had work-life balance issues. but she also was very concerned about her son's safety. In the TV version, not only is she a much more beautiful actress, but she has no son, and so it's simply about her efforts to solve this corruption. There are a number of other writers that we ran across. One that we wanted to mention is a much newer writer, a woman named Julie Novikova, who is apparently has a science background and writes both detective stories and also science fiction stories. And she's a very young writer, and so she may be sort of the wave of the future. When we were visiting with Micah's class, one of her peer students mentioned to us that we should look more at parody, that Czech writers, including television, like comedy and parody, and not only are there famous parodies of Westerns, which you love this, not only are there famous parodies of Westerns, but there are also a number of parodies of crime genre programs. And I suppose in a way the Father Knox series is a kind of parody, because it's really about the mistakes that detectives make trying to solve crimes. And so each week's episode is about the detective messing up. The detective makes a mistake, and so the audience is not only trying to figure out what the mistake is, but who committed the crime. And so the idea of parody is apparently a very popular thing. I did notice also that there was an old movie made in the Czech Republic, and I don't recall the name of it, that was a parody on the tough guy private detective that was so popular in Hollywood movies in the 1940s and the 1950s. And there was a takeoff that was a parody made on that. One thing that Nancy and I just finished watching, and again this was a gift, and I'll try to say this correctly, is a recent film that came out called Stinu, which is a fascinating film, and it takes place in Prague in the 1950s, and it involves a man who's a police captain in the police department in Prague trying to solve a murder that is being blamed on a Jewish community center. And it seems that everybody is in agreement that the Jews are trafficking in illegal currency and that they have killed some people and they have to be prosecuted and even executed. They're viewed as enemies of the state. And what this police officer learns is, well, I'm not going to tell you what he learns because you want to watch this film, because it's an excellent film and you should all see it. But it's a very good example of a Czech version of the crime genre. 1950s, takes place in what is becoming increasingly a communist nation, and even the police are under surveillance by state security, and it's a very good film. We've also noticed that there are increasingly, and I don't think we have time to show the clip, but
we might.
Okay, increasingly there are films that are from other countries that are being made in Prague. And when we were here in the fall, we met some people in the Prague Shakespeare Festival. And one of the co-owners of the Prague Shakespeare Festival is an actress named Jessica Boone. And Jessica told us about this series because she's in it. She has a continuing role in this series.
You want me to try to show?
Okay.
Hey, you're out early this morning, Becca. No husband, no kid. At least not till tomorrow. Next stop, bubble bath.
Now this is supposed to be Vienna, but it should look very familiar.
Basic geometry, pal. May not be possible.
It has to be.
What's a rule?
I can't remember.
Dad, I don't want to leave the ball. Signed by you in hand.
Then leave the teapot.
The teapot's for Mom.
Okay. You pack the teapot. I'll carry the ball. pushing you around?
Oh, you know I like my routine. Plus running gives me time to think.
What? How much you're missing us?
Oh, there's always that. And I was also thinking about maybe adding one more to us.
Are you saying this just for me?
Nope. I'm ready. I'm ready to start trying.
Okay, great.
So hurry home. We got some work to do.
I'll be there as soon as I can.
Dad, my turn.
You said that your son wanted to talk to you, although he's being awfully subtle about it.
Just get to the mushy part already.
I love you, Becca.
And then Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. How's Vienna? It's okay. Dad dragged me to some stupid bridge and got all weird about it. Was she, huh? Totally. Where your dad and I met is.
Hey, Mike, you got your ball. Can we run inside?
So, Mom, we're at the Milano game and guess who is sitting 2 rows back? I have no idea. He's only the greatest soccer player in the world. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't mean anything to me.
So the conceit of this series, and this was again a year-long series, shot in Czech Republic, aired in the United States, is that Ashley Judd and her now blown-up husband are CIA agents with a little kid. And after her husband is blown up in this bombing incident, to protect her son, she leaves the CIA and opens a flower shop and becomes a regular soccer mom. Scroll forward 10 years, and we see her running again, now with her teenage son. He informs her that he wants to study architecture in Rome. She's reluctant because she's afraid of international stuff. Maybe she's already seen the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, and she knows this is dangerous. You know, but she loves her son and allows him to go to Rome, where he's immediately kidnapped. And so she, in a sense, gets back into CIA mode. The CIA won't help her.
And here she is looking for him in Rome.
Yeah. And she's
just done away with this fellow who attacked her. Of course, it was self-defense.
Doesn't look like Rome to me.
And there she goes.
And so each episode is her pursuing another lead, basically around Europe. This is presented as a very European series. Most of the installments are shot in Czech Republic. Our favorite joke is the French scenes are shot at Chez Marcel restaurant, which is about 10 minutes from here. But it says Chez Marcel, and it looks very French, you know. And so most of the series is shot there. Again, this is supposed to be Vienna. It's also where the Klimt curtain is in Karlovy Vary. Judd is a very successful actress.
But some of it really is supposed to be in Prague.
Yeah.
You know,
a lot of it is in
Prague. They don't totally. Yeah.
She's a very successful actress. She produced this series, starred in it. It lasted 1 season. There is rumor now that she may run for the United States Senate in the United States, but I think she's pulled out of that race and will not be doing that. In any case, what we have seen written and argued quite a bit over the last several years, whether it's femi-crimi in Scandinavia or the feminist crime genre discussions in the United States, is that there is increasingly a move by women authors or by men authors writing about women to create books, TV series, and films that are more about women. Now, in part, this may simply reflect the fact that with the passage of time and legislation, at least in the United States, that women are more likely to be police officers in the United States or the United Kingdom or Czech Republic than they used to be. And so, in some ways, the crime genre has always followed the reality of what goes on in crime, at least to a degree. And so, maybe that's understandable that such a genre would be emerging. There's quite a bit of discussion about what this means if it's true. Some people argue that the feminist crime genre, femi-crimi, is less violent than traditional crime fiction is. Other people argue that even when it's violent, the violence is less gratuitous, or that the real impact of violence is shown. When people are injured in programs like this, they are actually hurt. I think at one point, Ashley Judd's character is wounded and she's shot, and she is debilitated from this and can't do her work quite as much. And so people argue that there's more of an attention to either less violence or the reality of what violence does. That the storylines are more relevant to women. And lastly, that the storylines are more likely to deal with issues of social justice. Justice in a larger sense, not just who did the killing and can I capture them? Who kidnapped my son and can I catch them? That typically there are larger issues afoot than just that. Now all of these are up for debate, because you can see certain programs that are not quite so on point with these kind of arguments. What we're interested in, though, is Nancy mentioned at the beginning, is trying to get a sense from you to the degree you read the crime genre or watch it either in TV or on film, or don't. Why is this? In other words, no insult, but your data. So anybody, why or why not?
Or what do you like or what do you not like? That's the other thing.
Our pens are ready. Proceed.
Have any of you watched The Killing? You watched this? Because we haven't seen it. There's a version of it in the U.S. and it's not as good as this one. But some friends gave it to us and said, you have to watch this. So that's how we started to watch it.
Maybe I can start. I can say that I don't like these films very much because it really makes me scared, and it somehow reminds me to the fact that as a woman, I basically, it's the feminist discussion about women having the feeling constantly that they can be attacked, and I don't like the films reminding me this. Because very often, as you also focus on the victims are women, and you see very real the crime scene and how it all happened.
This one, The Killing, is so, the beginning is so dark, it's hard to see what's going on in the thing, but that first scene particularly, I was going to say, you're seeing a woman running, and then you're seeing the next scene where Sarah Lund is investigating, and did you all think that she was going to find this body? I certainly did when I watched it the first time, that she was going to find this, and instead it's a joke, and a joke kind of indicating acceptance of her colleagues, of her, thanks for a great year, although with some humor there. But how did you feel about that? I mean, because it's sort of like it's making you afraid, and then it's sort of turning it into humor. And then another scene, the next scene is going to be that she's really going to find the body.
What I liked about the character in the Danish series, or I found it interesting that she had quite a few kind of manly traces. As you said, she had a problem balancing her private and work life, and her family becomes angry at her increasingly with the progressing of the series, and she even becomes quite violent at work, or aggressive. So she had, I thought they were quite sort of manly characters about her.
So that it shows that it's not just because a woman's doing that job, she's not going to be all,
Nice.
sweet. The other thing, as she goes on and she's obsessed with the case to find the killer, which some way she takes up a crusade to find who did that to this woman. Nina Burke Larson was the victim. But then they start to treat her as though she's mentally unbalanced because she's so obsessed with the case. So she exhibits a lot of tendencies of men, but then she's still treated like a woman in some ways. Yeah, sure.
You're seeing more and more series where it used to be series that had the very glamorous detective woman or something, you know, you thought her hair is never out of place, she looks like an actress or a supermodel, and that just isn't real life. But they did a prime suspect in the United States recently. I think it only lasted a season or two.
Right.
But an actress named Maria
Bello
was in it, and she had sort of like a fedora hat, and she dressed very masculine, and she had problems at home. She would show up to her boyfriend's house with a black eye, where she got hit by knocking someone down and stuff. But also, you see that they almost have to be this sort of masculine, to sort of fit in. So I'm wondering where the line is that you can't have sort of an actual honest woman who looks like a woman and yet is still a cop or something. It's almost like for television that's just not believable either, even though that they do exist.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the whole notion of dark and hard-boiled is really in now with these kinds of things, and so it's like in that you're getting these women characters. They're no longer the femme fatales. They're what you're describing, these tough. But I know I have the same feeling. It's like it's a mixed thing of, is that an improvement or is it still some kind of new stereotype that's emerging? Did any of you read crime fiction novels or books?
Yeah, I want to speak.
Yeah.
To the original question. As a lit major, I did tend to avoid crime fiction as a little too genre, not literary, in sort of a snooty, stereotypical sort of way. And it wasn't actually until I traveled to Scotland and picked up an Ian Rankin novel and read it, what I found, and got into his books, what I found worked for me in that sense was his depiction of Edinburgh and a completely different perspective via the crime genre that you would normally get in a lot of more literary novels, which have their own benefits. But perhaps maybe in the States, I wasn't more as interested in, the seedy underbelly of New York City or Seattle or something like that. But in loving, loving the UK and Scotland, these sort of things, and particularly Edinburgh, it was nice to get that different perspective and get that sort of underground sort of, viewpoint of Edinburgh that, again, I think only crime fiction could provide. So that's sort of what drew me to it.
One of the things that's been alluded to in terms of the success of Scandinavian crime fiction, the novels, is exactly what you said, that the depiction of, whether it's Copenhagen or Stockholm or whatever, is very bleak, very desolate, and indeed a lot of this crime fiction is not actually even set in the major cities like Copenhagen and Stockholm. It's set more out in the countryside, and so it seems even more bleak and desolate. And a lot of these things are, if they're television programs or films, they're filmed in the winter so that it looks even more so. And so that's, some people argue, part of the popularity of it. And similarly, that the reason it's successful in places like the UK and the United States is that it's not Los Angeles. And it's not London. It's some place that people really haven't been, or they haven't seen that side of Edinburgh. And so that is, some have argued that's what makes this kind of fiction more popular, because it gives a different perspective.
Does anybody read some of the more, what are the term for them is cozies, where they're like manor houses or that kind of fiction? No. Miss Marple. I know we have one Miss Marple.
Well, this is another, as Nancy said about Agatha Christie, that she's the third bestseller in history behind the Bible and Shakespeare. So Stieg Larsson is a phenomenal bestseller. His Millennium Trilogy has sold 65 million books. Agatha Christie has sold 66 billion books. 66 billion books. And her crime fiction play, The Mousetrap, is the longest running successful play in history. It began in 1952. and is still off Broadway in London. In a sense.
I wanted to ask if anyone had seen Expositura. I know
I've
you.
seen a few series.
What did you think of?
You know, I think that the main female character, I don't know how to say it. I think that she was shown as very capable, very honest, you know. She was sort of like a moral attribute there. But in the same time, she was cooperating with this guy who actually sort of knew that there is some problem even before. And at the end they start to date. And she seemed to be a bit like, I don't know, from my perspective, he seemed to be still quite like in charge, or definitely the one who got the idea first, you know. So I don't think that you can so much compare it to, I don't know, this other sort of characters. You know, I've seen also the movie The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or it's like Men Who Hate Women.
Yes.
And I think that there, the main character is really like super capable, much better than any man there. So it's super cool, you know, like a role model. Also, how she's independent, all these characteristics prescribed to women, that they need some secure relationship. She does not need anyone. So I found it much more cool than this woman in Expositura. Yeah. Much more sort of appealing, you know.
Okay.
Sort of like when I was small and I saw the movie Home Alone, and I was thinking, oh, would I be ever so cool, you know, to manage all these rubbers, and they would enter my house when my parents would be away. So I had the same feeling. Oh, would I ever be so cool? And yeah.
Yeah. Would you do all that? Has anybody read Julie Novakova? No. She seems fascinating to me, and I haven't just learned about her, but she's also a biology student, and on the side, I guess she's writing all this fiction. So when I was a student, all I could do was be a student. Well, do you watch the Law and Order? Is there a Law and Order version here? Do people watch that? Not much. Still really, really popular in the U.S.
It's on here. You know, and they have a spin-offs too, because I know they just started the series that has Jeff Goldblum, which I think was not Special Victims, but Criminal Intent or something.
Okay. What else do you like? Anybody else have any other crime fiction things?
I didn't see these series, neither films, but what I saw in Czech television was another series. I didn't watch it. I do not watch it, but I saw some episodes from the series, and it was about a French detective. Her name is Julie Lescott, and this character, do you also know? I see her as she has a son, a small son. She is divorced, but she has good relation with the former husband, and he is also somehow taking care of the son. So they are somehow switching, if I understand it well. And she is not really pictured as a woman with male characters, male signs. She's rather a capable woman who is also a mother. And I think that quite a lot of attention is given to relations in the small team she is the boss of.
So part of the thing on these shows is it may be that what we like to see is a multiplicity, a lot of different characterizations, like there are of men. That there's some programs where men are completely, hard-boiled and they drink all the time and do all this, but then you have other ones where they're not, and that what you have is that you have more of a variety. There was a program in England too that had a woman police officer who was a single mother and had children, and she was, what was the name of it?
Blue Murder.
Blue Murder. And she was balancing her work and family, and her husband was divorced, but he lost his job, so he started taking care of the kids some because she couldn't always do it. So you see more of a variety in there. But I want to just talk a little. How many of you saw this film, Vestinu? Yeah. Well, what did you think of? I never say it right. I'm working on it, but I never get it right. But what did you think of that as far as the sort of portrait of masculinity, femininities in that film? So we just watched it recently, so.
Well, there was definitely this figure of the moral father who wants to be the right, honest father for any price.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he also was sort of an absent father, an absent husband. His wife was lonesome, but I thought it was interesting. He really did want to be a moral person, but you saw his work-life balance stunk, and they let you see that it did. I don't think they made it like that was just normal or okay. I think that they showed you that was problematic.
They make it an issue. They're discussing it with the wife.
Mm-hmm.
He's not there.
Mm-hmm.
He's leaving again. Yeah,
and even he discusses it with the German guy who's sort of maybe his adversary, and that guy says, you have a really nice family, you need to attend to them a little bit. But then at the same time, he's dealing with big issues about the future of the country and communism and what he thinks is a corrupt government, and he's sort of telling his son he's going to make the sacrifice. But it's really interesting, I think, in that way that to me it problematizes that kind of masculinity, but you also understand why he was doing it too. Although I don't think I could have taken as many punches as he did, but
one of the claims of the feminist genre is that women are typically depicted in this genre, whatever their role is. So there's some kind of investigator, there's some kind of protagonist, but they're typically depicted in this genre as being involved with other people. Maybe simply as friends, maybe a support group, but they have other colleagues and comrades and simply friends. And that's juxtaposed with the more standard male-centric view of the genre, in which you have a lonely private detective working late hours in his office who apparently is answerable to no one except his client, or police officers who don't do anything except work. And so you see that many of the women characters are depicted as being more a part of a group of people. Sometimes these may seem to be contrivances, but sometimes it's also a part of the story. In Blue Murder, for example, the woman who plays the police detective has a teenage son, and once she's divorced, her son begins having problems. He's upset that his parents have had a divorce. He's upset that his mom is away a lot doing cases. And so he begins to, the term we would use is act out. He begins to mess up a lot and becomes involved in petty crime himself. His grades deteriorate. And so as a mom, who's also a police officer, she has to deal with this. There was another series that was on several years ago that was a British series, and one of the things that struck me as interesting about it, there were two detectives, a man and a woman. And the male detective was a member of the aristocracy. And the woman detective was a very working class person. But what was also interesting about this series is that she had a very ill, aging parent. And so she couldn't simply run around day and night pursuing villains. She had to deal with an old parent who was not in good health, and if she went out for the evening, had to make sure that somebody was there with her parent. And so I thought it was a very interesting program because it's the sort of work that we all exist in. I mean, we all have jobs and we work very hard at the jobs, but we have things that go on in our lives. You know, we get sick, our family gets sick, and
at the same time, some of these other ones, these real, you know, dark noirish, like The Killing, show, I think, increasing isolation, because that's a big theme in these things. And Vesti knew that he was increasingly isolated and kind of on his own at the end. And I think Sarah Lund is like that. And so you see that. And certainly with the girl with the dragon tattoo and all of those, I think she was, so there's a lot of isolation. And I'm wondering, and we can discuss this at the end, but the popularity of the noirish and the isolation and the sort of bleak future, I'm wondering what that is saying about how that's tied to the context that we're in right now in the world. But I think we ought to say, just these are some of the things about why experts say, and I think not on here's what Brian said, but about, a lot of it is about location, that you're reading these too in order to learn about an area, to see maybe a side of a country or city that you're interested in, but a side maybe that you wouldn't know. There's a book that is a Chinese writer. He lives in the U.S. now, but Qiu Qiaolong has a series about a Shanghai police detective. And he's a male writer, but he writes about women in a really interesting and complex way. But he also just has a really interesting take on China as it's transitioning from the old, you know, cultural revolution to the increasingly more market society and what that's like, and the goods and the bads of it. And he's also a poet, so he's a police detective poet. But these are some of the reasons that other people say and talk about as why people would like it. I'll leave this up for a second, but then I think
so all of these things to us are still unresolved. Supposedly the femi-crimi, the feminist crime genre, reduces gender stereotypes. The question, of course, is, does it do that? And I'll give you simply an example, and this is a little bit of a counter example to what Sherry said. So the program CSI, which is extremely successful in the United States, has numerous spin-offs, it's been on since 2000, has a number of women who it depicts as being very capable and competent crime scene investigators. You know, they have jackhammers and they're climbing around on roofs, but they all have low-cut dresses and they climb around on roofs in high heels, and not really, but when they're in the office they do. And so they are more standard in terms of the depiction of a woman who's a beautiful model type woman, even though they're depicted as very competent. Some of the scenes in the TV show Missing that we didn't show are fairly violent, and one thing that really troubled us is in one scene, Ashley Judd, who is trying to find where her son is, and she thinks he's about to be killed, engages in torture. She tortures a suspect. We don't see that on screen, but we hear it. And so, and it's depicted as, well, she's a mother. And a mother would do anything to find her missing son, including torture a reluctant witness. And so she tortures her. And in a kind of zero dark 30 kind of a way, the torture works. Because she tortures the woman, she finds out where her son is. As opposed to the fact that maybe the woman would simply have lied under torture. Whether the male gaze is reduced or not is another story as well, but probably one thing about this that is true is, to the degree that women are shown as the protagonist, as the person who's home alone and takes care of the situation competently, even if there's a certain level of the gaze that is seeing this, it still is showing women who are competent, who are professional, and are not simply victims. They're able to take care of the job. The other issue is, do these women pursue justice, or do they simply produce criminal justice? Do they find out who did it, and that's the end of the story? We felt like in The Killing, although Sarah Lund finds out who murdered that young woman, there are so many things that are unresolved in the story that it's hard to say that it promotes some larger sense of justice, simply that justice has been done in this case. One of the things that interested us about Prime Suspect is that in some of those installments, there were larger matters that were dealt with, or at least they were acknowledged. There were attempts to deal with them. And then finally the issue is what was always maybe part of the criticism of genre fiction is the good guy, bad guy binary that is very simplistic. The way we would say it in the United States, which comes from old westerns, is the good guy always wore a white hat and the villain always wore a black hat. And so you could see who they were. They were visually coded by color of hat. And so some people argue that in some kind of modern fiction that's less so. I mean, you see Sarah Lund increasingly isolated and not being a good mom. And in Prime Suspect, Helen Mirren, as Jane Tennyson, does a lot of fairly nasty things to people. She lies to witnesses, and she's not always a good person. And she does this, though, in the pursuit of justice. So,
and we're interested in all of this from a standpoint of, as teachers, we use media to teach and to talk about justice issues. And so that's one of the reasons we're always trying to think about what are the takeaways from these programs. And we've worked a lot and talked about in that other book that we wrote about a model of progressive moral fiction to use for teaching. And part of it is that we like our students to watch these things and take away a sense that yes, there are problems in the world, and here are some of the problems, or there are problems in this region, or there are problems with this issue, but here's something that an individual or a group can try to do something to address the issue. And some of the programs that end with this very nihilistic, there's nothing works, and the person, like I think with Sarah Lund, she tries to do justice and do it, but it winds up, everything sort of goes bad for her. And I think volume 2 we haven't watched, it gets worse still. And so that, we sort of wonder about that. But when I talk to people around, a number of my students have said, but that's how it is, and it's important to give people a sense of reality. So we can end with that and have you ask your questions.
I want to just pick up on that line you have said, if these series or criminal novels promote justice or simply criminal justice. And I wanted to ask, if maybe when I'm thinking about these issues, I would, add another dimension, because, many of these TV series are designed in order to attract what is viewed as the taste of the mainstream viewer, in order to sell the TV series. So that I would say is the reason, that some, or I would say maybe the majority, are more simplistically put, also in some maybe stereotypical pictures and focusing only on criminal justice or some kind of very particularistic aspect. But on the other hand, the huge success of Stieg Larsson novels shows that the taste of the mainstream readers or viewers is not such, it's not limited in this sense. And Stieg Larsson actually puts this in a much broader context, and there are some very criminal acts, and he tries to solve this as well, but it's really framed within the whole rotten society, and
It's much broader. But then, I'm kind of fan of Stieg Larsson, so I saw the Swedish movies and also the American movies. And if you compare these two, it's even more visible that the American movies really limited the spot even more. You know, the Swedish movies are kind of already limited, and it's understandable. You need to pick only something from the book, but it focused more on this criminal side. And then the American series focused even more on this only criminal aspect and just cut off all the broad social issues. So so I would say that this consumer-driven, profit-driven industry is actually limiting the way how the criminal novels and criminal series are.
I think that's really true, although I couldn't stand to go see the American versions of the Stieg Larsson, but because that's from the previews, that's what I could tell. I probably should watch them, but that's even in terms of the Maria Bello version of Prime Suspect, the U.S. version. The very beginning dealt with some of the same issues that the British Prime Suspect dealt with, but as it went along, they did less and less of that. And I think, of course, what do I know about TV critics, but that's one reason it never caught on. There was nothing to distinguish it, and it actually hurts ratings in a lot of these cases when they pull all of that out. But that's what they think they have to do to make a hit. Sometimes that works to make a hit, I guess.
But also, then it's also a lot of money to shoot a TV series or a movie, and maybe they are also forced, or a little forced, softly forced to cut off some issues, because otherwise it wouldn't be acceptable for those who finance those movies.
That happens in TV because there are programs that have good ratings that get canceled because the sponsors don't want to be associated with.
If you see the TV series, I'm not really familiar with the criminal series you've shown, but other ones, there you can really see pushing some kind of propagandist agenda today. And just one example, for example, this doctoral series, Grey's Anatomy, it was really pushing the agenda of Iraq's war. You know, when in the US it started to be seen as increasingly negative, and people wanted to get away the American soldiers from there, and it was really behind the spot. You know, this pro-war agenda.
The Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah.
Wow, I watched it, but I got tired of it, so I stopped. But I didn't know that. Huh. Interesting.
Well, you know, one thing about any TV show or film too is they really are maybe dealing with the lowest common denominator, and they really are afraid of insulting people or something of that sort. I won't go into the detail, but we had a friend who was a very interesting woman and had a very interesting lifestyle, and she lived in Los Angeles, and a friend of hers produced a TV series about her life, and it was a comedy because her life was very funny, and we saw the series, and it was horrible. And it was horrible because everything interesting about her life that made it funny was viewed as, oh, this could offend someone. This might offend these people over here. And so all of those things were so sanitized that her life was no longer funny. It was just boring. And so in some cases, you can make a program so safe that nobody wants to watch it anymore. And I think maybe that's what happened with Prime Suspect. We were very excited about it because we just finished this book about the British series, and we're thinking, ooh la la, a US series, another book, serious articles in high-impact journals, and the series lasted it only lasted about 6 weeks, but it lasted 6 weeks because very quickly it became undifferentiated from any other police program in the United States other than she had the hat.
I think we all, I know there's food, so we should continue discussing over the food part. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. I know, great. I know. Well, it was great to get to run into you, so maybe we'll see you.
When are you back next?
Probably not till next spring, May or something like that. So, but I got your card, so we'll get in touch.
Let us know.
Oh, are you still on the Fulbright committee for the SIND? Do you do the students or the professors?
We do both.
Oh, okay. Because Elena may be applying, so I'll tell her to come. But I mean, I don't know if you have any recommendations or suggestions.
Once they get through, they apply and everything, then we start seeing them after they get sort of they make sure they are applicable, and then